All right, here we go.
Welcome back to the Necropolis AD show. NADS for short is the acronym. And we do have a few pairs of NADS here. We have Shelley from hatemeditations.com. Thank you, Shelley, for joining.
Thanks for having me on. Happy to nad it up.
Yep, we got our NADS in here. A lot of teabagging. It's not only a sausage fest, but it's a NADS fest too. A really sweaty, musky NADS here. And we do have a special guest. We got Christopher Dick from Decibel Magazine. He'll be really elaborating on what the quote unquote institution of metal is, being that he's been a journalist for Decibel for over 20 years now. So really looking forward to his input. Thank you for joining, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's the first time on this podcast, and again, I'm writing for Decibel since 2006. So this is my 20th year writing for the magazine. Decibel is a U.S. based print publication, and it is the only print publication that's monthly for the genre of music that we all love and hate, if you want to call it that. But previously to that, I was writing for Metal Maniacs. I had my own website.
Oh, so you know Craig Zoller from Metal
I did.
Maniacs?
Yeah, of course.
He's been on here a couple times too.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know him, but yes, I was a co-writer with, on the same sort of stable of artists and writers. Previous to that, I ran a metal publication online called digitalmetal.com. And that was a sort of a co-found with Matt Jacobson from Relapse Records. And we had a big internet presence up to about 2006 and then kind of whittled away. And then prior to that, I did zines in the 90s. So starting in 91, I had a zine called The Requiem through 97 with a guy who does illustrations for Decibel called Mark Rudolph. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. Does fantastic illustrations for other people as well. Carcass, Pig Destroyer, you name it. And then had a zine after that called Eclipse through 2004. So I've been writing about metal for the better part of my life, and I don't think it's going to stop.
Yeah, it's quite a resume, a CV you got there. And one thing that we had talked about on the side was that you knew Alan Moses, like you were a pen pal, because Alan Moses ran the Covenant of Death fan club for Morbid Angel. And Alan Moses was my gateway into death metal. I met him when I was 12. He was the maintenance guy at the private school I went to. So while I was supposed to be learning about Jesus and all that, I was listening to Morbid Angel, Blessed Are the Sick. He brought in his own copies signed and told me to read the lyrics. And I'm like, I'm going to hell for this shit. But yeah, it's really interesting that you two had been in contact through the mail. So one point of connection there, other than us both knowing Daniel Lake.
Correct.
Yeah,
Alan. Alan. Real quick, Alan and I used to, back when I was a wee lad, as they say in the UK. I hope they say that. I was trying to figure out. I lived in a small town in Michigan, trying to find my way through the vagaries and obscurities of the underground metal world back in. This must have been 1990 into 1991. I was, heard Altars of Madness, Love Blessed Are the Sick, and I'm like, I'm going to write to the fan club. And that was Alan who wrote back and, didn't even ask me for money, but sent me a shirt, right? Morbid Angel shirt, which I, as from, I guess I was 16 or something at the time. That was like incredible. Like nobody did that stuff back in the day, right? I mean, this is always, pay first in cash and then you get something maybe in the mail, right? So that kind of spurred a lot of conversation with Alan over the years. And I didn't learn until much later that he was actually Australian because I thought he was from Florida, right? So that was kind of a funny joke that we had, between us over the years was that he was actually not Australian, but he's rather American and from Florida.
Yeah. The Australian connection is really big. He started his Buttface zine in Australia back in '89, I believe, and there was only two like real issues with that. But it just spread like wildfire. He sent it all over the place, and he had two offers. He had an offer to move to Florida and go work for Morbid Angel, or to move to England and work for Napalm Death. And he chose the better band, in my opinion. But yeah, everyone who came in contact with Alan Moses has really good, memories of him. He worked at Aces Records, which is a legendary record shop in Tampa.
Yep.
I went there when I was a teenager. I bought all my first death metal albums there.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was right. I went to when it was right across from University Square Mall, um, and it's just a different location than where they started out at. And it was like there was a Doberman behind the counter, bars on the windows because it was kind of a sketchy area of town. But
Hmm.
it was metal, metal, metal. I remember seeing like I bought some back then. I liked death a lot too. I bought all these death patches and put it on my middle school backpack.
Awesome.
Yeah, but Alan's really influential to me and my just coming into extreme metal. He really guided my hand when I moved to Texas when I was turning 13. He wrote a two-page list of albums for me to buy because that was before the internet. Well, the internet existed, but I didn't have it, and I had like no idea where to go. When I moved to Texas, like how am I going to discover more metal? And like he just gave me a list of all the classics. So yeah, it's one of those things I studied for 2 years and slowly packed away and got most of those records and really really owe Alan Moses a great debt because just how influential he was to me. But getting into the topic of today's podcast, so you had recently done the Necrophire cover story
Hmm.
for Decibel Magazine, and I was one of the people that you had interviewed. And on the side, we kind of had a discussion because I've been working with some guys in France, and I told them, I was like, hey, I just met with a journalist from Decibel Magazine for a Necrophire cover story, and they hadn't heard of Decibel Magazine. And I was kind of thinking, it's like, well, is Decibel primarily here in the U.S.? Like, I know Shelley shat on Metal Hammer too in a recent article of his. So I guess like Metal Hammer is more of a UK thing. That's their main publication, and then the US is Decibel.
Hmm.
And there's not really much overlap with those two scenes, quote unquote. Is that true?
Shelley, you want to go first?
Um, yeah, so from my perspective, a few years ago in the UK, we used to have Terrorizer, which covered more of the stuff that I would think Decibel covers now, more extreme metal.
Hmm.
Not exclusively so, but more so. Metal Hammer did a bit of that, but would also go more into sort of more popular bands like, I don't know, Machine Heads, things of that level. These days, they're probably even more sort of focused on the biggest bands in the rock metal oeuvre. And then over the top of all of that, we have, of course, Kerrang, which does cover metal like legitimately, and we can get into that later, but it's more of like they will happily cover pop punk and bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers as well. So they're like the go-to generic rock mag in the UK. I think anyone that has their head screwed on in the UK will have heard of Decibel because for my money, they kind of, Decibel puts a lot behind some of the biggest extreme metal bands of today, bands like Death Heaven and Blood Incantation and so on. And I think anyone that's heard of those bands will just be aware of Decibel because you've obviously got the massive festival out there, and I can't sort of avoid that on my social medias because various bands that I follow will be plugging it all the time. So I'm a little bit surprised that fans in France or people in France hadn't heard of it, unless they just they just live in a different sort of social media algorithm to me. But yeah, I think it's not widely known here, but most people that are into metal will be at least aware of Decibel as a significant publication.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Chris, you had mentioned earlier
Hmm.
that Decibel's model is primarily just North America,
Hmm.
and that the it's better to be a big fish in a quote unquote small pond, even though America's huge, and it's not really that small of a pond. But I was thinking, like obviously the print magazines, kind of not being as big as they used to be due to the internet. Decibel Magazine's business model has changed quite a bit.
Hmm.
Like you have festivals, beer and metal festivals twice a year. You have
Right.
um, even the kill screen video game column. Like a lot of these different, of course, the books too that Decibel puts out.
Hmm.
There's all these other ventures that Decibel's engaging in. So the print magazine is that really profitable anymore for Decibel?
Uh, so to answer that question, the answer is yes. Otherwise, they wouldn't put that out. So I don't think these businesses And again, we're talking about metal here, so we're not talking about social media or Google or whatever, where there's millions and millions of dollars or billions of dollars at stake. This is again, big fish, small pond, and everyone's sort of striving to cut the same nickel, some proverbial sense. So yes, the magazine's still profitable. It relies heavily on subscriptions these days. Not so much say newsstands, because those newsstands have gone, right. I know Barnes and Nobles is probably, here and there. Borders is no longer around. Grocery stores don't really have a magazine section anymore in the States. So anywhere where there would be a magazine of music of a niche genre, even that could be prog, for example, or glam metal or whatever, new metal, whatever. Those things have gone, right? So the magazine is primarily based, subscription based, and that's where the revenue comes from. And obviously, advertising, each issue helps as well. So yes, so the magazine's profitable, but there are other business areas that the Decibel as a brand works in. So you have your print publication. Obviously, we have our online store, which is you sell everything on the online store. We also have our books division called DB Books, right? So we're putting out, the Scott Burns book was very popular. The David Gelke Scott Burns book, the Chuck Schuldiner book that we just put out is getting a lot of attention. We have our own Hall of Fame books where we reprint the Hall of Fames, which are the oral histories in each issue. Those are also in book form. But there's a lot of different books. We also do some, sort of partnerships with Cult Never Dies. So, they took our Paradise Lost book, they printed it in the UK. We took some of their books, like the black metal book that Dale wrote. We, put that into a US version, which is basically edited by Albert and team. So it's different from the original version that came out in the UK or came out in the rest of the world. So there is a lot of what I would call localization happening on the DB book side. Getting into other elements, we also have DB Records, which is a Decibel Records section. We do not put out our own records except for maybe, I think, the Dead Guy reissue, but a lot of it's like limited edition copies of label releases, like, for example, I don't know, Horrendous from the States, Kylesa, trying to think of the other ones that came out, Con 8, Venomous Concept, At the Gates, Arch Enemy, Obituary. So, we're dealing with live records or records, sort of limited magazine versions of those records, limited colors, right? Our colors of those albums. So yeah, it's a pretty cool thing that we do. So we have books, magazine, we have records. Now let's get into the Decibel Tour, which is, a stateside tour. I think there's some Canadian dates as well that get sprinkled in depending on what bands are allowed to cross the border. So that's been going for, I don't know, 10 years now. And that's as popular as ever. So that's annual. So, one tour a year. And then we also have our Decibel Festival, which is the Decibel Beer or Metal and Beer Fest. And there's two editions of that. One in the spring in Philadelphia, which is the home base of Decibel, and then one in Denver, Colorado. And that one is growing at an exponential rate. So to answer your question about is Decibel profitable, I think so. I don't have the books in front of me. I don't do the books. I don't see the books. But based on the growth path, it is a slow growth path. I would say it's a low risk type growth versus a high risk type growth. So that's why we don't have a print publication in, say, Latin America, even though there's a heavy presence of Spanish speakers in Latin America. That would be a high risk proposition for, I think, the company that owns Decibel, which is called Red Flag Media.
Right. Yeah. And I did, see some articles on Decibel. At least on the online website, that does feature a lot of the Latin American bands, especially some of the bigger ones. However, as we all know, like the scene in Chile and all that, it's freaking insane compared to what's here in the U.S. Like they have their own underground DIY networks, and there's a lot of like the spirit that I kind of feel coming from Latin America is really entrenched in like the old school forms of death and black metal and thrash, not necessarily, like the upbeat, piece of thrash that we have here, like Municipal Waste. But that scene, like I subscribe to a few YouTube channels that features just Latin American bands, and a lot of the stuff just completely goes under the radar. Won't even get like over 100 listens. And there's a lot of quality stuff coming from Latin America. So
Hmm.
there is a disconnect there, where there are a lot of Latin American bands that just simply are not breaching into North America.
Yeah.
Well, I say Latin America. Mexico is part of Latin America, but
Mm.
but like we were talking offline, about I raised the question, why don't you adopt the Vice magazine, the Vice News like model of just breaching, other markets and buying up competition and all that, and
Hmm.
really becoming like a worldwide institution. And
Well, didn't that end in failure?
it did, but I was thinking like, how big of a risk would it be, though, to trying to establish a footprint in Latin America?
For Decibel?
I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I have a business degree, but that's beyond the scope of my knowledge of. I
Yeah.
haven't done international business,
Sure.
but
I think you're not, that question is probably a reasonable one. And the reason why I say that is, it makes sense, right? You have a large, potential consumer base in Latin America. Now the first part is they don't speak English, right? They speak Spanish primarily. So do we have to have an entire new editorial staff on top of our existing one to sort of, translate the existing issue into Spanish, or do they actually have a whole different thing and they focus on Latin American bands, which would make sense? But that's a whole different cost. That would be a whole different magazine entirely, with just a Decibel, masthead or a label branding. So I think there's cost, right? There's cost of, setting up a headquarters. Where is it based? Is it based in Mexico City? Is it based in Buenos Aires? Is it based in Santiago, Chile? Where is it based, right? How do you distribute in Latin America, right? I mean, Latin America is, there are richer countries, there are poorer countries. Would those poorer countries not get those issues and only focus on, say, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and maybe Costa Rica, and then forget the other countries that are maybe have a little less spending power? Again, I think that all factors into the potential for growth in an area where we're splitting all the same nickel and maybe the same dime if we were to expand to Latin America. So we're not talking about $100 bill, we're talking about a nickel or a dime. And I think that's where it comes. I think it's economies of scale, and it's really just, I think the economics don't work out too much, because guess what? If it did, there would be magazines in Latin America that would be I'm sure there are, that are at the same level, if not bigger than Decibel.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned like working with Cult Never Dies earlier, and I just remembered purchased some of those books, and that's been my interaction with Decibel. But obviously, with that, there's no language barrier going on there. It's the same book, slightly different editions, and so on. But yeah, I guess the key would be linking up with the pre-existing media infrastructure in those countries and finding some sort of way to partner up. But going back to all of the fingers, all the pies, sorry, that Decibel has its finger in. It so it's almost like Decibel they're a media outlet. They cover metal music, they do features on bands, they write album reviews and so on. But they're also dipping their toe into creating the content itself, like the books, the tours, the festivals, and so on, the kind of things that you would expect a journalist to cover and write reviews for. Do you think there's any danger of like a conflict of interest coming in? Say if you've got a big popular band booked to play one of these festivals, and they happen to release an album, and Decibel are reviewing it, and would that impact the rating that they get in Decibel if they think, well, they're headlining our show, but we can't give them 2 stars out of 5 or whatever because that will piss off the band and the management and so on? Is there any kind of conflict of interest going on there?
I think that's a great question, because as I understand it, and I've been writing for this magazine for 20 years, so I've seen my fair share of reviews and bands that got covers, bands that got bad reviews, bands that got featured in the lead review that got bad reviews. So I think the way Decibel operates, which is different from, say, the continental European model, which is, let's call it pay for play. Decibel is far more moralistic in that state, in that way, I think, so for example, one of our favorite bands, Decibel staff predominantly loves is Catatonia, right? Swedish band. We reviewed the newest record that they're part of, which is Bloodbath, the death metal side project that they have with Nick Holmes from Paradise Lost. I reviewed that record and I gave that a pretty damning review. They were not happy about it, but it didn't, it wouldn't mean that we would not book Catatonia under the right conditions for a festival gig or a tour. If they said no because we didn't like your review, that's up to them. Or Bloodbath, they said no. That again, I think that's an interesting line that has not been obviously sort of crossed in my experience with Decibel. Could it be crossed? Absolutely, but I don't think Albert, who's the editor in chief, maintains a pay-for-play mandate, and I think that's antithetical to how that operates.
Okay.
Well,
and also,
okay, go ahead, Shelley.
I just one follow-up question. So, this is just me having a bit of a blind spot as to the coverage of, say, a festival run by Decibel. But are there other media outlets there covering it, and in theory will publish reviews in their magazines,
Sure.
or is it? Because again, it's is it sort of almost like letting your competitors review? And again, that feels like if they give you a negative review, it's like, well, they're just because they're a rival magazine or whatever. Like,
I mean, I think you have to remember that's possible, right? That for example, we review our own festival in the magazine. It's a retrospective of what happened. So again, we're trying to drum up hype for the next festival. That's common. Now, I think if we have other outlets come in and write a review and they don't like it, that's fair, right? I don't think there's a reason for us to say no to someone wanting to write a review about the festival. In fact, we encourage it because, again, I would say no. We'd rather have negative feedback than no feedback. And I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking how Albert would look at this. So yeah, I don't think I go to Norway, for example, to In Inferno Festival, to Beyond the Gates Festival, and I review their festivals. I'm not they pay for my flight, they pay for my hotel sometimes. I'm a quote unquote delegate. But if I don't like certain aspects of the festival, and I've stated that, I print that. We print that, and I get invited back year after year. So I don't think there's a conflict of interest. I don't think there's an encroachment on the business, because again, the business is highly small. It's very small. I don't think the people, and it's hard, right? Doing a festival is not a easy venture. You're dealing with people, right? The three of us, are coming together today. Imagine a magnitude of 50 times that. And you got attitude, you got ego, you got money, you got management, you got booking agents, all trying to get, a spot on the stage. So it's all very hard. It's all very complicated. And again, you're dealing with people. Some people are more reliable. Some people are less reliable. How do you manage that chaos and make some order out of it? So that's why I think there's, whenever there's a festival that's at Decibel trying to review it or cover it or mimic it, I think that's all fair game. If they can do it successfully after we do it, that's cool, right? There are festivals before Decibel. There are going to be festivals after Decibel, right? So I don't think there's a protectionary measure here or a protectionary stance on what we do and why we do it.
Yeah, MDS still seems to be the biggest festival here in the U.S. And I know
it is.
Hell's Heroes is getting quite big in Houston. How would you compare those with you said the Colorado, the Denver Air and Metal Festival is quite large and growing and growing. Is that about the size of like Hell's Heroes or something like that?
So I've never been to the Denver festival. There was actually previously in Los Angeles, and that didn't go out. That didn't go too well. I mean, at least in terms of, marketing and getting people to show up. But the minute we went to Denver, we started small, and are slowly starting to grow. And I think this year we were able to migrate from the Wiltern to one of the one of the Live Nation venues for Blood Incantation, and that was, I think it was sold out. So I don't know how that compares capacity wise with what Hell's Heroes does. Because again, Christian, who does Hell's Heroes, he's kind of got a niche, right? He's kind of doing the traditional heavy metal. He's got some black metal. He's got some death metal. He's got some other things sprinkled in. Whereas Decibel is more curated around the magazine. So I think aesthetically, they're two different things. Size wise, I think they're two different things. I think Denver is growing. Philly is probably at the capacity it's going to be at. It's not probably going to get bigger. So if Hell's Heroes gets bigger than that, great for Christian, great for Hell's Heroes. And if Denver gets bigger, that'll be just amazing for us as well.
I see. And one thing I kind of notice is I'll raise a question too. Do record labels still have like pull over what's featured in Decibel Magazine? I know when you interviewed me for the Necrophire cover story, you mentioned that there's this new wave of American black metal, and you mentioned Necrophire, Black Braid, and Worm. Worm has recently signed to Century Media. Necrophire's recently signed to Metal Blade. So do those labels like still have sway over what's featured, and especially the cover story of the magazine, since you did the Necrophire cover?
I think cover stories are a product of a decision made by Albert, thinking about what's coming out in that month or that month and a half between publications, and what makes sense. What record is good. So I don't think it's about the record labels per se. It's what's good. What does he like? What does he think the readership will like? What's an interesting story to tell? Are band members interesting? Are they kind of boring, but the record's good? How do you sort of juggle that? So the record label comes in and says, we have this record coming out. Here it is. And I think Albert simply says, I think this band has a story to tell. They're on an upward trajectory. That's cool. The record's good. Let's go ahead and put a feeler out. I'm sure he has a backup plan for every single cover story that we do, and probably a secondary backup, plan B, plan C, in case those bands fall through. The label falls through. Maybe they don't organize well. And I think that's kind of how it operates. So I don't think the record labels have sway. In fact, I think it's the reverse. I think Decibel has sway.
I see, but those labels are buying ad space too. So there is a level of influence going on
No question.
Okay.
I mean, I think that those two things are related, but not connected. So the label's going to advertise anyway, for the most part, right? So Metal Blade's going to advertise a full page ad every single issue, whether it's a compilation ad with a bunch of artists, a bunch of releases, or they advertise just for, say, Necrophire, because they're on the cover. So I don't think the label spending money on the magazine because the artist is on the cover or featured in the magazine. I think what will happen is the label will say, we have an artist on the cover. Let's spotlight that release almost entirely. Let's say it's an 80% Necrophire ad, 20% rest of Metal Blade releases. Or what they'll do is they'll say, here's just the ad we put in every single publication we advertise with, and you get that ad. So I don't think there's a focus with the label to say, you're featuring this artist on the cover, we're going to pay for the advertisement. And Albert says, well, okay, how much? I don't think those are part of the calculus of cover, story, artists, promotion.
Well, I just meant more like general partnership. Not necessarily.
Yeah, it's a partnership for sure. Absolutely.
But not necessarily like, hey, do us this favor and Albert obliging or anything like that. Nothing like that. Yeah. In your face, but just a long-lasting partnership. Say Metal Blade's been, buying a good chunk of advertising space, for 20 years. Obviously that partnership is there. Whereas where you have something that kind of fits the mold of being a cover story, an up-and-coming band like Necrophire is, it just, that partnership existing, I can see it's like, okay, yeah, this fits the mold. Let's do the cover story. And of course, I'm not trying to shit on Necrophire or anything, but, Dauber is definitely an interesting guy, and I support Dauber 100%. I'm just saying that, it's kind of visible that partnership's there. I don't think
that partnership's any different from any other partnership on the planet. That is what I would call, a complementary relationship, right? I mean, since people were releasing records and publishing reviews or interviews, I think that's been there, right? The agency or the entity that's producing that album or that product is going to seek to promote it somehow, right? I mean, that's kind of how this all works. So it's really like it's a handshake, right? It's not like there's no contract per se that I'm aware of that says you must advertise X amount, and then the label says, well, part of that contract says you must feature X amount. I don't think those things are going on. Maybe it happens in other magazines, but certainly not Decibel.
Okay. So the subtext behind some of the questions here, I can't speak for Jason, but for me at least, is you can speculate for years on people's motivations for giving positive or negative reviews, and you mentioned earlier on like how many moving parts there are to put on a festival, and people will always complain, oh, you didn't book this band, or you've only put that band on again, or blah blah blah, blah. And you're never going to please everyone, so just do what you do and just hope that it's as best as you can possibly make it. And that's true of also criticism as well, is just giving an honest, interesting, knowledgeable review that is hopefully interesting to read as well, whether that be positive or negative. But I'm more asking this more in terms of your, not as a Decibel question, but a general metal media question, both as a fan and a journalist. But the impression I get is that the coverage is just a lot more positive than it used to be across the board. And I'm not saying that's always done in bad faith. It might be that, they're getting people that are genuine fans of the bands that they're reviewing who do like this stuff. But it's one of the reasons why I lost interest to some extent in what counts for like mainstream media in this environment. I mean, I get this as well. I'm a small-time blogger, and people still comment saying, "Oh, you've only reviewed that negatively because you have a beef with so and so." It's like I've got literally no like skin in this game. I'm just doing it for the fun of it, and that's the whole point of me being like completely not in the pay of anyone. But and also it's like it's a small-time operation as well. But I know that even sort of bigger bloggers that are still completely independent, I see them hand waving a lot of stuff where I'm like, not only do I disagree, but I feel like you're hand waving that because you're hoping that the band will share that on their social medias and they will share your blog and so on. And I'm not doing that to criticize anyone in particular. It's just sometimes a sense I get that this synergy has got to the point where music criticism is kind of going out of the window a little bit. So I just wanted to get your opinion on whether you see any truth in that, and if so, what you think the reason might be.
Yeah. So very complicated question to answer. But I think, let's look at it from a number standpoint. So I would agree with you that I would say the average rating for Decibel is probably between a 7 and an 8, right? Now that average over time, I don't have the data to support this assertion, but I would say the average over time has probably stayed the same, right? And this is the number of reviews that we do per publication or per issue, and the ratings that each one of those records gets, right? So there's going to be an average of rating reviews, average number of reviews, and average number of styles. So death metal, grunge, stoner, black metal, whatever. So I do agree that the general consensus that most records are good. So, there are about 30 different writers for Decibel doing features and reviews, right? Each one probably doesn't talk to the other very much about the things that they're writing about, right? So I can count on my one hand, how many times I've talked to a writer about what they're doing for a particular issue or future issues. Over 20 years. That's maybe 5 times. So when I write a review, I'm giving you an honest answer of like, how would this grade in, let's say, a typical 1 to 10, where a 5 is a 50%, a 6 is a 60%, or a D, 70% C, 8 B, and then above that's A, right? So let's look at it from a grade, high school grading standpoint. Most things are a B, right? Because I think the playing field for metal has, in general, become better than it was. And I'm going to say this is a general statement. Better meaning everyone has access to better tools these days. The musicianship is generally better than it used to be because there are better tools, better resources available to everyone. So, the water level has risen and everyone's rising with it, because technology is changing. gotten cheaper. You can make records in your house now that sound just as good, if not better, than a record made in a studio with the wrong engineer. So that's changed. So now we have bands that actually are sonically pretty good. So the production values are coming up. The cover art's generally pretty good. I'm not talking about AI. I'm talking about pre-AI. So everyone's doing pretty well. Now you say, okay, so how do I separate the good from the great? Now that's a subjective question across 30 different people. What I think is a 9. So I reviewed this new French, well, they're not new, but French or a Quebec-based black metal band called Miserere Luminous. I'm sure I'm murdering that word or that band name, but their new record Sedera on Debi Mortis, I gave a 9, and because I was feeling it, production, songwriting, aesthetic, everything was right on for me. Other people heard it, they're like, I think this is like a 5, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. That's not how I feel though. So the things that they like, which could be like Mortician style death metal, I'm going to be like, yeah, that's a 2. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that over time, things have gotten better, but the ability to separate good from great is harder. And I think scoring a record from, disastrous, like say a 1 or a 2 or a 4 or 3 or 4, right? That is sort of below 50 percentile. Doesn't really happen that often anymore. Back in the day, bands would put out records, and I'm talking about the 90s, even into the early 2000s, where things just kind of sucked. There was no reason for that band to put out a record. That's why you had bands that were worse than in the Swedish scene, that were worse than Carnage or Nihilist or Entombed or Unleashed. There was tons of bands underneath that, right? C level bands that are now getting A level attention 20, 30 years later. And they're saying, well, why is this record's great. It's better than anything Entombed did. I'm like, I don't think so. You're getting the luxury of time. This record did not live up to its standards of the day. Therefore, it was not promoted very much. Therefore, nobody talked about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think
it does.
Yeah, the advent of everything just being so accessible, like the cost effectiveness of getting a band together and recording. You can just do it at home, and a lot of people have home studios and all that. So yeah, there's going to be a general massive influx of just a lot of shared quote unquote content coming out, but there's also an element of, because it's so easy to record nowadays and release stuff, and there's probably a record label for every band out there. You just have to find it, no matter how small or micro label it is. But I think there's an issue of a lot of bands not really letting the music incubate. Like they just put it out there real quick, and I see it all the time. There's a lot of Bandcamp bands, just constantly flooding everything. A lot of, even like in the granular level, like here in Texas, there's a lot of bands that just self-release everything, and they just kind of flood the scene that way. But there's the sheer aspect of, back in the early '90s and late '80s, the bands practiced and rehearsed that material. They refined it for longer periods rather than just churning out release after release. Eventually that became the model,
Right.
bands releasing stuff every year. But there was a point where it actually incubated for a long time for bands to find their voice. And it's something that I've kind of picked up on, and it's something that's been discussed on this podcast quite a bit, is like metal seems really stagnant. Like we don't have this new, back in the '90s there was death metal, and then black metal negated death metal, and there's this great evolution of different bands exploring different forms within those genres. We don't really have it that much anymore. We have quote unquote avant-garde or disso death, but a lot of bands, they just kind of mimic the form rather than having like a authentic expression there. I know Shelley will echo that a lot. Do you believe that's because of technology itself just being so available for bands to record and release stuff, or like what's the relationship Decibel has with? I know you have the website that posts like a new album premiere every day. What's the general vibe that Decibel has? Does a band have to be together for 10, 20 years to get recognition, or just
No.
have a record label relationships such as Metal Blade or Century Media for
Mhm.
like Necrofire and Worm? Like,
Mhm.
what's Decibel's relationship, the sheer amount of metal coming out?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem everyone has, right? That you're basically fed an assembly line of releases, and that could come from labels like Metal Blade, Century Media, Nuclear Blast, etc., to smaller labels like 20 Buck Spin or Dark Descent, all the way down to bands that are self-releasing because they don't need a label, right? They're doing things on their own, DIY, and more power to them. Um, so how do you separate, the wheat from the chaff, as it were? That is really up to Albert's ear. I think, again, it's a curation. It's not I'm accepting everything and letting, the magazine is not going to accept everything. Now, let's just put it that way. Again, it's Albert. He's curating things. He's trying to figure out what he thinks is good. Um, and it doesn't have to be the band is formed in the last 10 to 20 years, because let's face it, that would be a terrible idea. We don't want a bunch of old guys writing music and only getting coverage, where the new generation, which should be where we put our focus on, are not getting the coverage that they think they need or deserve. So I think it really spans the gamut of new bands forming in, let's say, last 5 months, 6 months. If they're good, if they put out a release and we think it's good that we want to promote them, we'll go ahead and do it, right? I mean, promoting meaning write about them. And a band like Lamp of Murmur, for example, they technically have a label, but they don't do interviews. We'll write a review about them. We've probably offered to interview M from Lamp of Murmur. Um, but again, they're kind of DIY. They do their own tours, they do their own thing. And Worm were very much similar to that before they got on 20 Buck Spin, and then before that, obviously before they got on Century Media. So I don't think the label weight or the band membership age has anything to do with what we want to cover.
I see.
So
Uh,
coming back to sorry, Jessica, go on.
yeah, I was just kind of like the world Shelley and I live in is kind of different than the what's quote unquote mainstream underground. We should say like the Blood Incantation and all that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shelley and I we're kind of drawn to like the more traditional forms of death metal and black metal.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really good release that comes out here and there, but it's not really that often anymore. But what typically clicks for Shelley also clicks for me,
Mm-hmm.
especially if a lot of these bands coming from Chile nowadays, like there's really
Mm-hmm.
good competent stuff coming from South America, but there's like this huge divide between what we would consume for pleasure versus what would be in decibel. Like, I guess you can call us elitists in that regard because
Mm-hmm.
we are drawn more to the more conventional forms. Like I heard a Worm track, and it reminded me of like mid-period Jimmy Borgir, and it sounded like carnival music to me. Whereas, if I want, symphonic black metal, I'll listen to like the first Emperor record,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Where what I'm trying to get at is like, does Decibel not have a favorable view of like really traditional forms of death and black metal? Say it's rooted in the '90s kind of expression of like black metal or death metal. Would that just be kind of cast aside for what the general vibe is in the American scene?
No, I don't think there is we have a thing we're looking for, but that is subjective, right? I mean, again, it really boils down to what's good. So if it's traditional, let's say traditional style or traditional themes, aesthetic, and it's bad, meaning it feels sloppy, it looks sloppy, the band members are assholes, why cover it? What is our readership going to get out of that record that they may discover that in Bandcamp or on Instagram or something like that. But what are we going to get out of that? What is our readership going to get out of that if the membership or the band isn't good? So, and again, good is subjective. So what I think is good, I reviewed the new Worm record as a lead review and I gave it a 7, right? I think it has merit in spots, but I think it needs a lot of work in others. I mean, and I like the previous records and EPs. So um, I don't think it's a case of not liking traditional things or not covering traditional things that are more pure in sentiment and statement, is it good?
Right, yeah, and
Um,
I think Samath, Godless Arrogance, which is like a modern classic for Shelley and I, just the way they deconstruct like really aggressive black metal. It's more like listening to an orchestra of
Hmm.
how um, each instrument works together, and there's this great synergy between each musician. Like the drums just come in, add this whole new element, and like everything
well,
breathes really well like
Jason,
an orchestra. Go ahead.
I hate to break it to you, but that album's 12 years old now.
I said a modern classic, modern as in like
I know it's technically
past
modern, but yeah.
15 years,
Um,
but they still
can I
release,
just
since then some really good material, but I don't ever see them like being featured in Decibel or any like Metal Hammer or anything like that when
Mm,
they're steadily putting out records and stuff that's definitely above average.
sure.
It seems to be
well, if I could
just
just
Go ahead.
I'll
Yeah,
just jump in quickly.
please,
Sorry.
please, please.
So yeah, the comment on the standards being much higher now kind of did get me thinking down a few different avenues. One is like I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think the subtext of that is that we forget that in the late 80s and early 90s, we just remember the classics, but a lot of shit did come
Totally.
out and it was
100%.
quite bad.
Yeah.
The other flip side to that is like I think it's a popular thing on social media to post contemporary reviews of albums that are now considered classics. Like I saw one the other day on like Under a Funeral Moon, another one on Deicide's first album where the reviewer just absolutely rips them to shreds, and it's like ha ha ha, weren't they kind of history was not kind to that review, and that now it's just considered iconic or whatever.
Mm.
And it just feels like that's kind of
Nope.
exemplifies. Yeah, metal was still quite youthful back then. It was still, as Jason kind of described earlier, it was still developing a lot. Styles were changing around a lot, and that means that accidents happened a lot. There were lots of terrible albums, but also there were lots of albums that weren't accepted at the time and have now been kind of rehabilitated, or opinion was wildly divided. Like famously, a lot of people outside of Norway fucking hated black metal when it first arrived because it is a very confrontational sound that you need to get used to, and we are
Hmm.
now used to it. But to bring it to the modern day again, the thing that I get, and I'm sure every reviewer gets this, is the fatigue of hearing 10 or 20 albums a week, all sort of marginally similar,
Hmm.
wondering how to even sort of listen to them, let alone find something interesting to say about them. And for me, that's why I can be very cutthroat with it. And I have the sort of luxury of doing that because I have no stakes in it. I'm just a sort of like I said, an independent blogger that kind of has the freedom to kind of do that to some extent without worrying about how the audience will take it, how it will affect my bottom line or anything like that.
Hmm.
But do you not find, again, I guess I'm kind of asking you as a fan as well, but do you not kind of find, like I wrote an essay a year or two ago about like listener fatigue, that there is so much material coming out, like you feel like you've just digested the latest album from your new favorite band,
Hmm.
and then an old favorite band will release an album. You're like, oh, I've got to sort of work up to passing that, and then there's just all this other new material that I need to get my head around as well. A
Hmm.
lot of it's kind of all of a similar standard. None of it's terrible. None of it's completely objectionable, but none of it's grabbing me in the way that an Altars of Madness grabbed me or whatever.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, I guess how not asking you to speak for Decibel necessarily, but more as just a fan and a journalist. But how do you sort of see your role in that in terms of bringing fans to something that is genuinely like exceptional over just like this is just okay. If you like this style, you will like this album. If you like symphonic black metal, you'll like this. If you like
Hmm.
the sort of avant-garde disso def or whatever, you will go for this album. But it's not like any different to another Disso Def album released last month or whatever. I don't know. Does that question make sense? I don't think I was very clear with that, but
Let me think about what you're trying to ask. Listener fatigue is real. Again, we get, let's say I get, as a journalist, and I'm put that in quotes. I'm gonna just say I'm a writer. I'm not a journalist. We don't really do journalism
okay,
here.
sorry.
You know what I mean? Like, think about it. We're not really journalists. We don't really we adhere to some journalist aesthetics and morals and mores, but we're not journalists, right? We don't go out and do things.
Yeah.
We're
Okay.
not investigative in that way. We're kind of being sort of spoon-fed stuff, and that goes back all the way to the early '90s when zines were doing stuff. But anyway, listener fatigue is very real, right? So at any given week, I would probably get sort of serviced through email, like, "Hey, check this out." Personally, over 100 plus records or songs or something to, "Hey, check me out," kind of thing. Most of the time, I'm ignoring those emails because again, I've been writing for Decibel for 20 years. I kind of know what I'm interested in. So I'm looking for things that, let's say, symphonic black metal, right? So Stormlord, right, which is Isaac from Blood Incantation, symphonic black metal, right? Very much inspired by some of the Norwegian greats, but some of the more obscure Norwegian bands, Obtained Enslavement, for example. So that might be interesting. I'll listen to that. But let's say Samoth comes around, the band you cited, Jason. I may not even know to even listen to that until one of my friends says, "Hey, I checked this out. I think you should too." Right. And that's kind of how we sort of get around listener fatigue, right? You either consume it all forever, and you have the capacity to do that, which I don't think most people do, or you start filtering out, or you start removing entirely, right? The things that you're getting fed through the what I quote the promotional assembly line. So did that answer your question?
Kind of, yeah. I think as you were talking, I realized what I was specifically asking is if I was a reader of Decibel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a tuned in metal fan. I know my stuff, but I go to a publication like Decibel, not necessarily, for okay, what's coming out that I need to check out, and I'm just met with a slew of reviews between 7 and 9 out of 10, and they're all roughly of styles that I know I like. So it's kind of like what to me, just purely from like in terms of utilitarianism, like that's not as useful as it used to be in terms of here's a 4-star album, okay, I'm not going to bother with that. Here's an 8 album, I'm going to check that out. Here's a 6 album, but I really like that band, maybe I'll listen to them and see if I agree with the reviewer or whatever. I'm not getting that anymore because I'm just getting a stream of kind of above average to pretty good album reviews according to whoever's covered it. So yeah, just in terms of like the purpose of music criticism, which I don't want to boil it down to just being consumer advice, but to some extent it kind of is. It feels like the efficacy of that is kind of disappearing a little bit.
I would agree with you. And I think when I first started reading album reviews, I would kind of drift to specific styles that I liked in the reviewers that I trusted. So in a way, there was gatekeeping happening at that level, right? So I knew the reviewer. Let's say Eula Garrett used to write for Metal Maniacs. I used to write some stuff for Decibel. I think once, used to write from. I think he did some other stuff, but he used to work for Century Media too, right? Anyway, he was a writer. I liked his style review. I liked the records he was reviewing. So when he reviewed something and gave it a bad review, I would check it out. I'd be like, why did Eula, someone I trust, gave this a bad review? Let's say At the Gates, Slaughter the Soul. He gave that kind of a lukewarm review, citing the vocals are kind of, a double-edged sword. I think that was the word he used. Meaning Tampa or Thomas Lindbergh was somewhat one-dimensional. Well, I disagree with that. So I went and bought, I knew At the Gates, and I was like, this pisses me off. Why did he write that? I love that record, blah, blah, blah. Now let's get into today when the gatekeeping has been nullified by the sheer volume of people who can do the same thing critics do. Let's say a music critic like myself and yourself. Anyone can pick up, a website, create a blog, create a YouTube account, and review albums. So now the gatekeeping has been diluted, almost destroyed, because there is now parity, or not parity, but there is now, parity is not the right word. There's now the ability for anyone and everyone to do the same thing that the gatekeepers used to do. So how do you find a voice that you like? This is how people get, let's call it Dead by Dog, the guy from Hell's Headbangers, he has his podcast.
Oh, yeah.
He has a very specific thing he's dialing in on pretty much all the time, right? He's got his voice, his tone, so people trust him, especially Hell's Headbangers customers, because they kind of know what he's about. I go in and I listen to him, and he's talking like how great Mortician is, and I think I've mentioned Mortician twice now, and that's I'm apologizing for mentioning them twice. I don't hear what he's talking about. I do not trust him at all when he talks about death metal in that regard. I would rather trust someone else, that, like Albert, for example, on death metal, or one of my best friends on death metal, versus the Dead by Dog YouTube channel, because I know he's going to be talking about death metal that is by and large generic, brutal. He may be friends with them, but at large it's American mostly. But a lot of times it's just straight up generic. I know his favorite band is Deicide, and I love Deicide, but I don't agree with him on the best album. Right. So, I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah. I mean, this might be taking a bit off topic, but
Chris, what is your favorite Deicide album?
Legion.
Okay, that's the correct answer.
But it depends. If you were to ask me 6 months from now, I'll say the self-title.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I oscillate between the two.
Yeah, it's an oscillation, right?
Yeah. This might be taking us a bit off topic, but I guess by that point you're almost not you, sorry, just one is almost going to them for the personality. Like I don't agree with Dead by Dog on a lot of stuff. I think his taste is a little bit too what's the word, specific. Like I like a lot of the same death metal that he goes for, but I think I have a broader taste and maybe a slightly more progressive taste in the sort of literally progressive music kind of way. But I go to him because he's an entertaining character. His takes are funny. He pisses people off. It's just it's entertainment in the same way that I don't necessarily or very often agree with someone like Anthony Fantano, but I'll listen to him when he's covering metal because I think he's an interesting guy. He's an intelligent guy, and I want to know what he's saying, because also what he says is kind of going to be taken as gospel by a non-metal audience that are tuning into him as well, because he doesn't, he covers metal only some of the time. And I think I've even had comments, not to sort of blow my own trumpet, but I even had comments like that on my own blog, is like people saying like, I don't agree with 90% of your views, but I like the way you write and the way you express it, so I still keep reading it. And that's almost like, that's when music criticism becomes an art form in itself, is when you're writing in a way that's entertaining but also insightful, and it chimes with people. And it is, and again, this is not me, I'm not slating Decibel at all, this is more of a broader point that I see in slightly bigger media outlets in music, is the writing can be quite generic and kind of boilerplate takes and it feels like the writer, whether it's an editorial line or whether it's the writer self-censoring themselves, but it feels like they're holding back on their opinions because they're afraid of pissing people off, which almost pisses me off more than people literally writing provocations to get a rise out of people, because I know that's a very easy tactic on social media, is make people angry, blah, blah, blah. But I'd rather that than just a lot of stale, bland writing about, what I would count as like stale, kind of sort of off the shelf modern extreme metal a lot of the time, where, it just feels like we're just, kind of in a bit of stasis, I suppose, in both the criticism and the music to some extent, with, some very notable exceptions aside. But
right. So let's look at Decibel, for example. Again, 30 different writers trying to express their opinion. I'm sure there's some cases where somebody's writing a better review because they probably have a relationship with either the band or the PR person or the label, or all three, right? Or some variants of thereof, right? So they probably have a relationship there. Like, I'm going to give these guys a 7 or an 8 because I don't want to, I don't want to ruin the gravy train. That's fair. That might happen. But I think what largely happened is, again, people are writing, what they generally feel. And again, music is so subjective that someone who perceives something as a 4 could be someone else is going to say it's an 8. So it might look that way from the outside, and there may be some of that on the inside, but I think as a whole, it's not that at all. My opinion.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I do take the point, like, most people are, there's a lot of genuinely talented writers writing for these publications, and they are trying to find that balance between being true to what their opinion is, but also you don't have to be a dick about it if you really didn't like an album, or you need to thread that needle, I suppose. Which
Totally.
I totally accept.
Yeah, I mean that's the hard thing, right? So as a music critic, let's put critic in quotes. Do you want to be a dick just to be a dick, or are you actually going to criticize something that actually is what you perceive to be bad or wrong? And you can be both, or you can be one or the other. I choose to be objectively cruel, but not really calling out, individual members per se on how they're doing something bad or perceptionally bad. Because again, I don't really know how the record was constructed. I don't know how it was recorded. But I do know that those members are listed on that liner notes or in that biography, and they're technically responsible. So I'm going to call them out and saying, hey, the production sucks. We've all done that. We've all called out album productions for sucking, and the producer or engineers have no fucking clue what they're doing. And they produce something that just sounds like ass, right? Or the band did, because they don't, I think, Suffocation famously from, was it Pierce from Within?
No, it was
what was it? Not Pierce from Within.
What's it called? Spawning.
Yeah. Anyway, it's the third record, right? It's the blue cover.
Yeah. Spawn.
Breeding the Spawn. There we go. I don't know why I forgot that. I should be hung, drawn, and quartered for forgetting that.
Yeah, they're going to be shouting at us in the comments for that.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. But they went to a different producer than Scott Burns, and they paid for it negatively, right? And they've been recording songs from that album since, because they hated the production and the producer of that record. So,
I actually read about that very experience in more detail in the Scott Burns book.
Yeah, right.
And I already knew the story, but it really did hammer home how upsetting it was for the band as well, because they were still pretty young at the time, and they lost their drummer over it, and nearly destroyed the band. So,
So I mean, again, maybe I'm losing sight of what the point is, but
sorry, it was about finding a way to be true to your opinions, without being unnecessarily cruel, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to give benefit of the doubt, the positive intent of every reviewer for, let's say, Decibel, because I have to, right? I can't assume that 30 people that I barely know, some better than others, are going to have some kind of baked in ill intent or, moral problem, ethical problem with how they review the records, right? I think everyone's putting their best foot forward and saying, I like this record because, I dislike this record because, and here are the reasons why.
You've been, as you said, you've been writing for Decibel for 20 years now. So you've been there for a couple of generation shifts. Like, do you, again, this might be a bit of a difficult question to answer, because it's not really any hard data on it, but do you get a sense that the audience, especially in the online world, they struggle more with reading opinions they disagree with now? They struggle to kind of process it and think, okay, I disagree with that person, but I can see where they're coming from, or we can have a discussion about it. Do you think an audience now is more just, you've slated this album and I really loved it and now I despised you, or vice versa as well, is like, you've written a really glowing review of this album and I think it's crap and I'm just not going to read you anymore because I disagreed with you on this one particular album or whatever? Do you think the audience is sort of struggling with that now more than they used to?
That, I have no idea. Does the audience engage with Decibel on social media more now than before? Possibly. I know that social media, there's in our little sphere, I think there's a lot of disengagement in progress with those social media, whether it's, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, etc. So I think people in general are, if you got the shit talkers, they're going to cause, they're going to be shit talkers. I think that the true fans can kind of cut through the BS and say, I know you didn't like that record. I love that record. I'm still going to read you because I do like some of the things you do, and I still think the value proposition, which is the subscription, is worth it. I don't think anyone's having a harder time now than they were before with the position taken on specific albums than they did, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
What seems to really generate a lot of knee-jerk reactions is stuff like when things delve into the political, when like musicians tend to voice
Mm-hmm.
their political opinions or
Yep.
even just their basic moral outlook or anything like that.
Uh-huh.
Like I remember Andrew Lee from Rip to Shreds
Mm-hmm.
was signal boosted by Decibel when he was talking about the issues he's had as a Asian American. Um, and I remember seeing a lot of the comments, and it was a clown show. It was a circus, and
Mm-hmm.
um, I was just kind of wondering. Shelley does have a really good point that people they don't really engage like they did, 20, 15 years ago. They just get a little snippet of what like an article is, or like a YouTube video, and they'll just have like a knee-jerk reaction and then go back into their little echo chamber silos. And I see this on all political spectrums, all
Mm-hmm.
everything like that. Like there are the issues of echo chambers and conforming to that groupthink within that um, echo chamber. So I know you don't perceive that head on because Decibel's a written magazine. There is no comment section on your reviews.
Mm-hmm.
But online, it's usually when bands will voice like, I saw an article on Decibel about a lady having issues paying her rent. Like her landlord was going to kick her out. It was this whole interview. And I just imagine if that, if I saw like when that was posted on social media, just like the comment section would be crazy on there. But it also kind of goes to show like, I know Decibel is more than metal. So Shelley, the headline of Decibel is extremely extreme. It's not extremely extreme metal, right? So a huge chunk of Decibel's readership is from the hardcore punk scene. And I've, especially at university, people who know Decibel Magazine, they know it because of that side of it. Like there's this one guy in my philosophy department, he's really into hardcore punk. And I turned him on to Blood and, other grindcore bands like that. But when he talks about death metal, it's usually just really basic. Like he just discovered Mortician a few months back, and he got into it actually. But the main death metal band he knows and he went to a show of was Dying Fetus, and he was just amazed like how the musicianship was so refined in Dying Fetus compared to the usual hardcore punk bands that he would go watch. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is. Albert, he seems to straddle a lot of different spheres with Decibel Magazine. It's not just the
Mm-hmm.
extreme metal side, but it's
Sure.
also the hardcore punk quite a bit. And with the
Mm-hmm.
hardcore punk side, you do have a in-your-face politics and all that. Is that why Decibel tends to allow people on the metal side to express their political opinions? Is because there is that kind of hardcore punk side to Decibel?
I don't know if that's the exact reason. I mean, I think that, we've had, politics is part of everyday life, right? Whether you're left, right, center, or no politics. Hardcore punk certainly is more political than, say, your average death metal, right? Average death metal is going to focus on, death, gore, horror movies, right? It's maybe Satanism to a degree. So when politics comes into play, it probably has some element from the hardcore punk scene. And again, that's extreme. So again, extremely extreme is relative, right? It's not just Portal every day, because let's face it, if every band that was featured was Portal, In Incantation, and bands like that, it'd be boring as hell, right? Impeding. Like how
More
how many
so on the
times can
Portal
how many
side.
times can you feature bands that are like that? So you kind of have to start to look outside the edges. And there's always been, to my understanding and my knowledge, that the Venn diagram of extremity, there's over Decibel's kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram, whether it is hardcore punk and they are expressing their political opinions, because that's kind of what's fueling that style of music. Kids that are pissed off don't really know how to play music, but they want to play music to express themselves, and they do so.
Right. And
Metal bands are a little bit different, right? They may have different motivations, not necessarily they're pissed off, but they love horror movies and they're able to woodshed for hours a day, and then they form a band because they find people who like horror movies, and other members are woodshedding as well. So you have industrial music that's politics. They may be more right leaning, let's say Laibach or something. I'm not saying they are, but they're kind of more martial. You have Ministry, who I've interviewed many times. They're definitely more politics, more left leaning, but definitely extreme to some degree, especially the middle period, I guess the '90s period. So there is a cross section that we're a part of, and we try to put ourselves in the middle of that cross section or that Venn diagram because it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't care that much about the political side of what's being put out there because music has always been inherently liberal. And, even going back to when it split from the church, you had secular musicians back in the Renaissance. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's always that aspect to the music. Having, generally left-oriented politics. But I guarantee, and I'm not trying to have this as putting you against a fire squad and, lining you up against a wall and all that. But I just kind of wonder, like, how should I phrase this? Like, if I were to download every article of Decibel Magazine and do a Control F and type in Trump, it would be 99% negative, right?
Well, I don't think you would probably see Trump mentioned by name very often. And that's probably, what's the purpose of saying I'm anti-Trump or pro-Trump? There's certainly going to be that case every now and again, right? But I don't think the magazine's particularly anti-conservative or pro-liberal. I think it's really where people fit somewhere in the middle, right? We're going to have, maybe more of a centrist view on the world. So again, you're going to have bands that are more like far left leaning, vegan punk, whatever, right? You're going to have bands that are more right leaning, maybe like say, when David Vincent, Morbid Angel. I'm sure there are other bands that.
Let's not get into David Vincent.
Well, yeah. But what I'm saying is, you're gonna have bands that have a more different view of the world than, say, Napalm Death, right? And I think that's all fair in Love and War, right? So, in that fairness comes the centrist viewpoint, or taking a non-political stance on politics, but allowing artists to state how they feel. Now, are we anti-fascist? Absolutely. Right? Are we anti NSBM? Not, of course we are. Because there's
I know, like Rob Darkin from Graveland, he's rescinded his prior comments back from like the '90s and very early 2000s, but he still hasn't been allowed back into like the quote unquote mainstream underground media. So he's completely blacklisted, right?
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in.
No, please.
I don't want to. I might just go out and bat for Decibel here, and it comes back to the point around you can't please everyone and threading that needle.
Tough.
If Decibel did a feature on Graveland, I imagine there would be some quite hard business decisions going on there around, well, how many of our subscribers are we going to piss off by doing that? Because take the point, Darkin has rescinded a lot of his views, but to a lot of people, he's still considered within that NSBM ecosystem. And to the point around like centrism is like, I think I'm sort of always of this view that nothing is apolitical and everything has some kind of political angle, and that makes me very suspicious of centrism. But I think in terms of the music press, particularly one that is trying to cover such a broad array of music, that is one area where it seems like legitimate. You are covering the views of musicians, and you will censor those views if you consider them to be outright fascist or beyond the pale in any sense. And that is an editorial line, and it will, to some extent, be arbitrary, but I think that doesn't mean that no line can be drawn. And I think that's completely reasonable. But I also think there is still space within that to, not amplify the views of the bands, but at least report on them. If you're interviewing a band and they do and express a political opinion, there's no reason to censor it, all of the things being equal. But to your point, Jason, that probably does mean that Decibel probably does skew to what you would perceive to be a left-leaning or liberal perspective, because the majority of bands tend to be that, even within metal these days. Like that's just where the majority of bands are, and that's
right.
it comes with the territory, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think you look at conservative views. I mean, you look at why is someone conservative? Where do they come from? They're going to come from Christian values. And what does most metal think about Christian values? Right? We are pro Satanists in a way. Pro freedom versus anti freedom. And I think that boils down to control. Conservatism, I would say probably boils down to control, right? And they call it law and order. I don't think that's really the case. I think it's control, right? The church wanted to control its populace by putting churches in pagan sites. It did that.
Well, there's
the church
hierarchy.
Wanted to control.
Yeah, there seems to be like some kind of hierarchy going on.
And there is a hierarchy, right? There is a hierarchy. So when you look at, what do conservative bands have to offer that are Satanists? To me, those two things don't agree with one another. You can't be conservative and be a Satanist.
I think
because conservatism is rooted in the tenets of Christianity. So you're a hair away from being a fundamentalist Christian by being a devout conservative and a Satanist. You
can make the argument that egalitarianism is inherently Christian since everyone's equal under God, right?
But do you believe in God?
People just don't follow that. The quote unquote Christian nationalists, they don't go by the Bible, word by word. Not saying I even like the Bible or anything.
But that's their fault, right? That's their theological hypocrisy.
But I wouldn't say that conservatism is inherently Christian because you have, look at Japan, you have the Bushido Code coming back into favor.
Right. Well,
before.
Right, but I mean, look at it from a Western point of view. The bands that we're talking about, the communities we're talking about, are inherently moored to the Christian church and the Christian value system.
That's a tough cookie for me to chew, there, Mr. Chris.
I mean, because how many bands that know about Taoism or anything from the Eastern school of thought that relates to conservatism?
Confucianism,
I would say very
conservative.
I would say very few.
Well, Confucianism is very conservative, but
what I'm saying is, how many people that we know would know about that, would adhere to that, and would relate that to the art that we manage and look at and love? Probably not very many. 0.5%, less than 0.5%.
But a hierarchy.
If I could bring us,
please.
Bring us back around to maybe the music press, which is what we are meant to be discussing.
In this context, discussion at some point, right?
No, but in this context, I guess, Jason, your contention isn't necessarily with the editorial line of Decibel, if they even have one on these topics, but more the fact that the bands they cover tend to skew left or liberal or whatever word you want to put on it to some extent, which is a wider discussion. I think it's a relevant discussion and it could be an interesting one, but it doesn't seem to be a problem with the music press itself. But correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jason.
I just mean there's a blind spot, and yes, there are some NSBN bands that I do believe should not receive any gravy, as you said earlier, but. In the case of Graveland, I think that's a really complicated relationship because he did rescind, over 20 years ago, he did rescind his comments and, the music of Graveland, I actually view that as being, up there as really good. I don't abide by far right politics in that aspect, but also I know this, the thing about conservatism being inherently Christian. They seem to look at it from a pagan standpoint, like they're vehemently against Christianity, like the Graveland, and you can dig into other like Absurd and bands like that, which I'm not a fan of Absurd at all, but
the thing is, you could be, right, and you don't have to be a fan of Absurd to agree with what he's doing. Just like, I'm looking at Burzum albums in my CD collection right now. I don't agree with Varg, but I still have his music.
Well, that was what I was going to ask, is maybe even though Graveland is, they're a very well-known black metal band, but I don't think they're that well-known outside of black metal, but someone like Burzum clearly is, because a lot of people that know of black metal, there's no line on
He
I'm not
killed
saying you would
someone.
do a no, but I'm not saying you would do a full feature on Burzum. But
We
surely
did.
they must come up when you're saying who influenced this black metal band,
Yeah.
and Burzum might come up as like, oh, this album sounds a bit Burzumy or whatever. There's no
Yeah.
kind of censorship going on there. It's just, well, we kind of have to reference it now and then because he's such a significant artist within that genre.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just an example I was plucking out of the air, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of another one, but he's obviously always the sort of go-to. Yeah, but just any kind of larger
Marduk's
band.
another one. Marduk's another
Well, I
one.
was going to say, yeah, the Marduk thing.
Mm-hmm.
Although they immediately distanced themselves from, I know their bassist got kicked out a few years ago for doing Nazi salutes on stage at a festival in London. But again, it was a similar thing where they, they did everything sort of by the book in terms of kicking him out and then releasing a statement. I understand, just distancing themselves from that completely. But for a lot of people, that wasn't enough. And then some publications just have to take the line of, do we still cover this band? Do we not? Like,
totally.
And that's just their decision, isn't it? So
totally.
What about Hay Forests?
Yeah, I mean, so you're going to get this, obviously Druk is going to have it, we're going to have shades of acceptance, but at the same time, if I accept this band, and let's say, when we did the Burzum feature on Philosophem, it was a Hall of Fame, so it's an oral history on that record. That was not met with disdain to a great degree, right? Most people, read that article, understood it, and I'm sure some people were like, wow, that's a great story. I didn't know about that about Philosophem. Great. Now, would we put Marduk on the cover for Memento Mori, the last record, right? The answer is no, because of that reason. That bass player did that, even though Marduk has, basically fired that bass player, come out against that. The scourge of that is a little, the wound of that problem is too fresh to celebrate, right? So when we talk about bands like Hate Forest, or you talk about bands like that kind of straddle that, you're not really sure where they sit on this fence, but they're sitting on that fence because it suits their purpose, whether it's to generate interest, or they're generally into that thing. That's up to Decibel to say, I want this, Marduk visually to make a great cover, musically amazing album, right? One of my favorites of what was it, 2023 now. But what would we face by putting them on the cover and talking to them? I would say, they could tell their side of the story. That would be a great opportunity. Other people look at that face value, and let's face it, most people judge a book by its cover these days because the internet has given us these short attention spans, and say, I'm going to unsubscribe to Decibel. I'm not going to listen to them, even though they put, say, Converge and Napalm on the issues before, and they put Marduk on the new issue, for example. Right, so you have two very left-leaning bands, and then you have a band that looks to be right-leaning, but really is only just interested in it from a Marshall standpoint. Had a bass player that did a Nazi salute. Okay, what do we do about this? I think that's kind of where the line gets drawn with Decibel and covering bands that are not necessarily right-leaning, but have somehow tied themselves to right-leaning things.
Yeah, and this is where I do I sort of see the sympathy of balancing a moral stance with the editorial line to some extent. Some artists are too big to ignore, and you just kind of can't. To give a non-metal example, like Michael Jackson, for example, he's sort of the other go-to example here. Is like, he's too big to cancel because he's the biggest pop star ever. The example, a friend of mine was asking me about Marduk and like, are they sketch and blah blah, and I was saying, yeah, aside from the bassist doing the Hitler salute scenario, I kind of liken them to something like Motorhead, because Lemmy had a fascination with military history, specifically Nazi paraphernalia and stuff. Yeah, people did comment on it at the time, but it was kind of like, well, it's more an aesthetic thing. He's disavowed the ideology. He made the joke about having a lot of black girlfriends, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But still, aesthetically, he did play into that a little bit, similar to what a lot of industrial bands do. But equally, Motorhead are just, if you're going to write about metal and rock in general, they're too big to ignore. You always have to just cover them. So it'd be a bit of a stupid thing to kind of censor Motorhead out of that history. Whereas a band like, I don't know, some of the ones we've been discussing. Like, much as I respect Graveland as an artist, you can kind of talk around black metal without mentioning Graveland. Similar for something like Hate Forest as well. But that's not the moral argument. That's more of like an editorial stance of like, where, yeah, we factor that into where to draw the line to some extent, I suppose. That's just my 2 cents on it. But
I mean, where the topic comes up of black metal bands being really influenced by Bathory, it'll be kind of hard to talk around Graveland in that aspect. But as a general rule, black metal, like the second wave, yeah, you can completely bypass Graveland, and you wouldn't really miss a main expression there. But I know Chris has to leave here, and we kind of drifted off into the political side. But I do want to thank you, Chris. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I can answer a few more questions if you like. I got to go at like 1:45. So if we want to continue like a thought here, we can continue a thought. I'm more than happy to stay with.
Yeah. So I'm glad we brought up the hardcore punk side of Decibel, because that's probably a side that Shelley doesn't see very often, right? Shelley? No,
no, I don't see it very often because, like I said, my interaction with Decibel is mostly through the bands that you cover, and obviously I'm more following metal bands than I am hardcore punk. Because as I said, I don't subscribe to Decibel Magazine, even though I do follow them online and got several of your books and so on. But the hardcore punk element is not something I see.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I like. I mean, I like hardcore punk to some degree. I like the older stuff. Some of the things that Decibel covers, I'm not interested in, right? If it's like stoner doom, not interested, right? If it's great, I'll listen to it, but chances are, if it's sludge, I'm not going to listen to it. Just not my thing, right? But if they're going to cover things like Thurgathon, or DeLorean, yeah, I'm game for that, right? So yeah, I think it's all Decibel again is a curation. I keep saying that over and over because I want to make sure that that point is understood. It's, think about it as, Albert has been doing this thing for 22 years, right? He knows what works, he knows what doesn't work, and he knows what he likes versus what he doesn't like. And then how does he manage those two kind of paradigms around the universe that's around him? Record labels, bands, PR people, tours, booking agents, what's good, what's not, and then he kind of tries to use his sort of mental sifter to sort of filter out what he thinks is applicable for Decibel. And I think I would do the same thing if I were him, right? Especially these days when you only have one magazine in the entire United States that's monthly in print, and that's Decibel. No other magazine's monthly. So people can disagree with the bands we cover, but at the same time, what other magazine is doing that in print monthly? None.
Right. So the demographics is the last question I wrote down, but I didn't know if we're going to actually delve into that territory. But I would assume that the general readership of the actual magazine itself would be a little bit older than the TikTok audience. So you probably don't have the info on this, just the general readership and how that's getting older. But I don't know where I'm going to go with this question. But I think imagine that just because Decibel is a print magazine that and the website itself, and the books, it requires people who read, and the younger generation. I hear a lot of like the Gen Z stuff, and they're coming into the university system, and I'm hearing a lot of horror stories from professors that they can't remove themselves from their phones, and
right.
I would imagine that the general quote unquote readership of Decibel is still skewed to primarily like millennials, right? Like that's
I would say Gen X and millennials for sure, right? I'm old. Born in 75. So I'm a Gen Xer. But what I think changed, I don't discount that Gen Z or whatever the next generation that comes after. I don't follow that stuff. Is no doubt attention starved because they're being so attached to their phone. I don't know the psychology around that. I don't know the data around that, but that's my assumption.
Well, I heard COVID did a number on them too. So there's
Well,
a lot of behavioral and antisocial
yeah,
going on.
but COVID did a different thing too. So during COVID, and I remember talking to Albert about this, subscriptions went through the roof because people wanted something tangible because they couldn't go out in the world and interact. So they started to buy books. They started to buy magazines. They started to buy, sort of tangible materials. So I think COVID, as negative as it was, has had a positive impact. And I don't know how great that crater is, probably relatively small, but it's starting to manifest a little bit more where people are buying physical media. You saw it with the vinyl resurgence, right? People buying records. Vinyl became more expensive. So people didn't just say, I'm stopped buying music altogether and I'll just stream. They're actually, CDs are, basically flying off the shelves again, which is weird. For several years, bands they produced maybe a cassette and a vinyl, but no CD because CDs weren't selling. But CDs are selling now. And I think that's thanks in a way to COVID pushing people to have tangible things. Separately related to that is the streaming services have proven to people that nothing's permanent. You may like a record, Tribulation, for example, Formulas of Death, their second record, right? That's not on Spotify. Why? I don't fucking know. But you can go buy the record. You can go buy the CD if, on Amazon or whatever. And people are I think people are doing that, right? Because they know that the minute they go to Netflix and they have their favorite series, Netflix can cancel it, get rid of it in like an instant. And now the thing that they loved, the thing that they held dear is gone in an instant. So I think they're buying books. I think they're buying physical media again, probably not at the volume that the casual consumer did, but the people that love their stuff are buying it now instead of streaming it. Or maybe they're doing both.
I'm finding the CD revival quite annoying because I've remained CD faithful since about 2001. And
brother, you and I both.
No, it's no, I'm joking. Yeah.
Oh, come on, don't joke. Don't joke.
But yeah, I was interested.
I got 5,000 CDs.
I was interested in. I don't have 5,000. I have about 1,500, I would say.
You're well in the nerd range. So anything above 500, you're in the nerd range.
Oh, fair enough. That's good to know. But yeah, the point around it being like a physical, almost like a prestige product to some extent. Magazines being that's kind of where you kind of answered my question there in terms of leaning into it being not just a source of information, a source of like reviews and features on bands, but also just a nice object to receive every month in terms of it looks nice, it comes with a CD or whatever, and it's it has collectible potential as well. And I see that with some other magazines going that direction where they're kind of just looking to beef it up, maybe reduce it down to a quarterly thing as well, but increase the subscribers that way because it becomes a thing that similar to like the vinyl record in that it was like a treasured possession. It looks very nice. It's very good to just hold and kind of interact with in that sense. And I love reading books and magazines over anything on my phone. Like I hate reading articles on my phone because it just feels just uncomfortable to some extent. But yeah, it's an interesting point. I don't really have a question off the back of that. I was more just commenting on it, but yeah.
Well, I think, for example, the magazine you write for in Portugal, is, I don't remember the name of it.
Metal Legion, yeah.
Metal Legion, yeah. Have you seen similar trends in that magazine, even though technically it's Portuguese? I'm assuming it's in Portuguese, probably only sold in Portugal, maybe in Brazil a little bit, maybe some in Spain or something.
No, it's an English language one,
English.
But
Okay.
it's sold online, but it's also sent to like various like record stores and stuff around Europe as well. But it comes with a free CD, it comes with a bunch of reviews. But we're kind of looking to restructure it as more of like a quarterly thing, so that it's something that people kind of rely on to some extent. Is thinking, right, that's coming out this quarter. It's not going to feature like the very latest releases because it's only every 3 months. So you might see a few album reviews from things that are 2 or 3 months old, but you are at least going to get an interesting, insightful review on stuff. Yeah, it's sort of leaning more into that angle as well, as you say.
So to your point, and I think the key word here is permanence. right? People, I think in general, are starting to feel that the things that they love, music, art, whatever, have no permanence, and AI is pushing that pretty hard. Um, so again, whether that magazine's monthly or quarterly, there's a sense of permanence to that magazine. People, again, they covet it because there is a sense of permanence to it. It's not something that will just vanish easily. And they can make that decision whether or not it vanishes. They can unsubscribe, or they can throw it in the trash or recycle, right? Versus some tech lord, in the metaverse, deciding whether or not something should be available or not.
Well, that does exist, yeah. Like there's no hate force on Spotify because of the far right stuff.
But are you sure it's about far right stuff? Are you sure it's not about something else? Like what, because Burzum's on Spotify, I think.
Well, Druk is on Spotify, but
exactly.
Hate isn't.
Yeah. So I
both
think
on Season of Mist.
I would assume hate force is a licensing thing.
Huh.
Most things again, tech companies are going to do what makes them money. If it's not completely obvious that, let's say there's a swastika on the album cover, right? Or a Hitler image on the cover. I think those types of things are probably more nuanced than just say, oh, they're right leaning, so they're not going to be on a thing like Spotify. I think it's probably more nuanced than that. It usually comes down to rights. Maybe Druk said, I don't want that on Spotify. That's in their contract. It could be in their contract where they don't want that on social media. I mean the label's not licensing that record out to for digital performance. They want it as underground as possible, physical or nothing. That could be in his contract.
They probably do boost CD sales when it's not, on Spotify and streaming platforms,
or just limiting CD sales. Or, he may be limiting that audience for a specific aesthetic purpose, unlike Druk, who's probably a little bit more wide ranging, and more known. Hate Force could be just simple. I want to keep this underground. I want to keep this physical. And if it succeeds, meaning it sells a lot of copies, fantastic. If it does, it doesn't.
Well, I know in Ukraine the American dollar goes very far because I spent a lot of time there. But but yeah, if you sell more CDs but not having it streaming, and he's probably getting better royalty checks, which enhances his personal life. But yeah, we kind of strayed off topic, and it was great to have you on, Chris. And
no, it's amazing to be here, guys.
Not Albert, but you did a great job talking about the ins and outs of Decibel. So thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Shelley. Very nice to meet you. Great to be meet a fellow CD addict. I'm going to call you that because you have 1,500 CDs. You must have either multiple shelves or multiple bins, and that's a commendable thing in this day and age.
Thank you very much. Yeah, 1,500 and counting. But yeah, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for chatting with us. It was a really good discussion today. So thank you.
Sure, I look forward to more, Jason. If we have time, we can get this scheduled around. I'd be more than happy to have non-decibel related conversation. Let's say the theological conversation. I know you're pursuing your PhD, so that could be a very illuminating conversation versus someone who's what I would call a Luddite. Or a Cro-Mag in terms of religious education.
Well, I'm not, really in the religious camp.
I know,
but I'm the philosophy side. But yeah, I start the PhD.
Yeah, I know.
Fall. So this summer will be great when I'm not busy with school. So this will probably be the last Necropolis episode until the summer. Just FYI, if you're still listening out there. Just completely swamped with school and all that. And like Chris said, we'll be starting a PhD in the fall. So I imagine I'll be busy then too. So
congrats on that, man. That's a big step in life, and in no mean feat for sure.
Yeah, I'm speaking at Yale, and I got accepted into an honor society because I have a 4.0 GPA.
Incredible.
Yeah, things are moving along. Yep, gonna get all educated and sodomize the world. All right, thank you guys.
With your brain, I hope.
With my dick's brain.
Well, we're all dick. Guys here. We have two brains, right?
My brain dick. All
right, guys. Very nice to talk to you. Hope to do it again. Take care.
Yes, thanks, man. Cheers.
Yep.
Cheers.
Bye.